I listened to a podcast recently. It was about the state of economics for the next president. Basically, what their brief. It was a bunch of presenters. It was through Cato. Cato is a libertarian organization, but it's a bunch of presenters on what would they tell the next president, the future of the economics of the next president. And there's one part that I wanted to hone in on, which is the regulations, the regulatory state that we have going in the United States right now. So, excuse me. So if you listen to, well, basically since Barack Obama became president, the United States has been on an economic recovery. It's not it's not because of what he's done. It's just that's when the stuff started picking up again. So it's just kind of the economic cycles. It goes up and it goes down, and we've been on a positive cycle during the president's tenure since 2008. Um, but it's been a very meek positive cycle, so less than 2% growth for a 10-year period, and that's very bad. In fact, um, it's never been that bad. We've never had such little growth in the United States ever. And so the question then is, when people want to ask, is what's wrong with the economy? Why isn't the economy growing? And so when you are listening to the shows, when I'm listening to the shows, my Donald Trump, when he's listening to the shows and they're talking, then they're debating or whatever they call it, where they put him on split screen and they talk angrily at each other. The Democrats usually will just say, "Oh well, the economy's great. We're adding jobs." That because they want to defend the president, they basically deny that there's any problem. Okay, and then the Republicans say, "Well, we need to cut taxes. We got to cut taxes. And there's no discussion of the factors that are actually contributing to what's actually happening in the economy. And the truth is, it's very complicated. That neither side is presenting any answers for the issues. And one of the things that I want to talk about is the regulatory state and what its contribution is to the our current economic flow, whatever, current economic growth. Donald Trump, actually, he's done the whole taxes thing. Got to lower taxes, but he actually, to his credit, one of the few things that I've found to his credit is that he talks about the regulatory state. He talks about how overbearing the regulatory state is, and and that's good. That shows that he at least understands one of the primary problems to solving our issues. Okay, so when you look at a business, when you're running a for-profit business, there you have your revenue, the things that you sell, the services that you sell, or the products that you sell, and then you have your expenses. And there's no difference between the expense of paying an employee and the expense of paying a tax or the expense of paying for a regulation. They're all expenses. I mean, there is a difference in terms of what the money is going towards, but it's money out the door that you're not getting back, and it's money that you're not making as the businessman. So we have to realize that when we have taxes, all that is an expense to the business. That's just another way of looking at it. And I know that um, we have that basically it's been sold that the rich need to pay their taxes. That these rich, wealthy businessmen need to pay their fair share of taxes. Well, what these rich, wealthy businessmen do, what these business owners do, is they look at how much the taxes are. They look at how much their employees cost. They look at how much their products cost to buy, the component parts to whatever they're putting together, and then they adjust the price to whatever that is. Um, and so adjusting the taxes is really going to adjust the product price. And ultimately it does hurt the people on top, the more wealthy people some, but it also harms the consumer, the person that buys the product. And I talked about this a little bit in the last video, the Measure 97 video. So, so among the different costs, and so is the taxes, but also it's the regulations. Okay, so on the podcast, I finally get around to it. On the podcast, we, or sorry, they said that there was a study that was done that said that there was 1.1 costly regulations per day that the Obama administration has instituted. And by the way, this podcast, I mean, it's the people that are speaking at it are from the International Monetary Fund, the former head of the CBO, Congressional Budget Office. These aren't like, right wing or left wing think tank hacks. Well, I think some of them actually. One of them works for a think tank, but the point is, these are more mainline people. These aren't just like far out people. Okay, so they said that there's 1.1 costly regulations a day. Now the government creates literally dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of regulations a day, the federal government and the state and local governments. But the federal government itself creates many, many regulations a day. And this one, they're just looking at ones that cost a lot of money to comply with. And basically, the way a regulation costs money is a few ways. One, you have to hire attorneys or other just people to comply with whatever the regulation says. So, for example, not necessarily attorneys, but it could be anything. And there's forms to fill out, all this kind of stuff. For example, with guns now, there's regulations where there has to be a background check and you have to fill out these forms. These forms have to be reviewed by the government. The cost of all those things is there's a cost to doing all those things. So before, when you could just go and sell a gun to a person and you didn't have all the, these different forms and stuff, and I'm using guns because everybody knows about background checks and all this kind of stuff. Unless you go to a loophole, then there's no background check. A gun show loophole. But anyway, so all these different background checks and forms and all these things, those cost money to do. That these gun owners have learned how to do them themselves, but all these things cost money and they cost time, so on and so forth. Now, if you have a complex industry, then you have forms to fill out, and these and things to comply with it take attorneys. For example, you could open a hot dog stand. Probably anybody within the sound of my voice could open up a hot dog stand and run it, effectively or not effectively, but you could run it legally. But you couldn't just open up a bank. Even if you had, say, $30 million to open up a branch, you couldn't just open it up. You have to have compliance people. There's thousands of pages of legislation regulating financial institutions and banks, and you need attorneys or people to comply with those regulations. So a costly regulation is one where it's going to require basically like a business to have a department of attorneys, and they're going to have to do their checklists every year, things that they do each time a year. Yeah. And and if you're like, for me, it's I am a tax attorney. I was an attorney for the Marine Corps, and basically this is all I've ever done, essentially, is not everything, but largely what I've always done as an attorney is this kind of compliance stuff, whether it's complying with military regulations or complying with IRS forms and regulations and all that kind of stuff. This has been my whole career, has been complying with these kind of laws. Okay, so the cost of these 1.1 regulations a day, so you're talking about, I don't know, what is that? 400 regulations a year, I guess, or so. They said the cost of these has been $100 billion per year. Okay, this is one study that I don't think that number is. I think that number is probably a little bit high, if not significantly high. And also the thing about businesses is they get better at they squeeze costs over time. They figure out how to make things cheaper, and that's great. That's why business is good. Um, so yeah, that's probably a high number, but it kind of gives you a benchmark. I mean, I have trouble believing that number just because it's such a huge amount, but it's significant. That's the point. So the cost is $100 billion a year, or over the course of the 8 years that the president has been in office, $800 billion. Okay, to give you kind of a, and so basically what they were saying, the point the guy was making, and I think he was from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, is the point he was making is that there is an $800 billion cost that's been added to business every single year in the United States by the regulatory state. In other words, no legislation has new legislation caused that. It's just the government saying, there goes my phone, that there's going to be these rules that you have to comply with. Okay. And to give you an idea of what $800 billion is like, the total amount of taxes, I just looked this up, collected in 2015 federally was 3.2 trillion. So essentially what the president has done in his time, President Obama, what his administration has done is they've created a yearly cost that's 1/4 of our entire federal tax system. Okay. So, and it's not even in the news. Like, this isn't, people aren't talking about this, right? I mean, when's the last time you turned on Fox or CNN or MSNBC or one of the network news shows, one of the networks, and seen this in the news? I mean, if taxes were raised by 1/4, it would be all over the news, wouldn't it? I mean, the quote Bush tax cuts, when those expired, I mean, that was all over the news, and that was, I don't know, that was maybe a fifth. I mean, it was a lot less than 1/4 of our current tax burden. So if you're wondering, so there's, like I said, there's lots of, and just to wrap it up, there's lots of costs. There's lots of reasons why the economy has stalled, and we need to address them, but we need to talk about each one and the things that we need to fix. And the one I was talking about today is the regulatory state. The regulatory state makes it hard to do business. It's an additional cost. It's just as harmful as a tax or any kind of expense. Basically, if the company has to spend money on the regulatory state, on complying with regulation, that's money that they have to increase the price of the good, or that's money that they can't hire employees, which is why there's very few jobs that have been created in the last 10 years. That we've basically, our workforce has shrank because we're not growing jobs. Well, one of the big reasons is because of these increased regulations. So yeah, let me stop there. I want to say something about the corporate rate, but I'll say that for another podcast. If you enjoyed listening to that, please like and subscribe.